Kate Campbell Stevenson, and I'm thrilled to be the host of this new program, Her Story. Women's history has been a big part of my life and has been inspiring me through the years. I've learned from these tremendous women who have broken through barriers and obstacles, who've come before us, and I would love to share those stories with you so we can learn together and be inspired about how we can really educate and help everybody understand that women's stories are important and that they're a part of our history, and we need to be bringing her story to history to tell our story, because we are all together in this. Today's featured woman is Lindzey, an extraordinary educator and women's advocate. So be right back. Welcome back to Her Story. Today we have educator extraordinaire Lindzey. Welcome to our show, Linda.
Thank you, Kate.
I would like to know what your first introduction was to women's history.
My first introduction to women's history was returning to college after 18 years and signing up to become an early childhood education major. And I had just lived through the the modern women's movement. Mm-hmm. My husband and I, our marriage survived that. And I was more interested in learning academically about women's history because, of course, when I went to school, it wasn't mentioned. Women were never mentioned. So as a minor, when I signed up to take my classes, I chose women's studies as a minor. And that's when I had my first academic introduction to the whole topic.
How did you incorporate this into your classroom when there was nothing written in the history books about women?
Well, you had to be, in those days, you had to be dedicated. You had to really be caring about the lack of information that people were getting about women's history, and also the whole approach, we called it then non-sexist approach to education. Mm-hmm. Now it's called gender equity. And in those days, we tried our best, a few of us, to find ways to get resources so that we could change the way teachers and parents interacted with small children and children all through school. You had to find your own resources, you had to make your own resources, and if you were dedicated, that was what you did above and beyond everything else that was happening.
How did you do that? How did you, first of all, what were some of the women's stories that you really wanted to focus on with your students?
Well, I can remember finding, there were a couple resources that you could tap into, and I remember finding a resource about Sally Ride, the first woman astronaut, and I taught kindergarten, 4 and 5-year-olds. But I thought it was important to incorporate women's contributions in all of my curriculum. It wasn't in the curriculum in Baltimore County. I had to augment my curriculum. And so when I found out that there was this resource about Sally Ride, I sent for it, and there was this wonderful little hand-drawn booklet with information about the first woman in space. And there was a little tape that came with it. In those days, we all had cassette tapes.
Of course.
This little cassette tape was a song about Sally Ride, and I can remember the tagline was "Ride, Ride, Ride, Sally Ride." And so I used that during Women's History Month, or when I was teaching the children about space travel. And I would make sure that I incorporated stories like Sally's whenever it was appropriate. We had the curriculum would include, for instance, literature. And so I was a fan of Beatrix Potter.
Of course.
The Peter Rabbit stories. And I saw a documentary on her and found out that she really was an extraordinary woman and actually a feminist, even though she wouldn't have called herself that.
Right.
And so I did more research on her, and we had this, in one of the schools where I worked, we had a literature month, and each teacher was asked to pick an author and have their class concentrate on that author's work throughout the month, and then we would have some kind of a presentation. We would decorate our doors, and we would have little presentations to go to the other classrooms. And so that was when I was concentrating on Beatrix Potter, and so I chose her. And in fact, I used to have this poetry program with my kids. I'd teach them to memorize a poem, and then they would recite it one by one and receive a little badge to show that they did their public speaking piece. And I could not find a poem about Beatrix Potter, so I had to write one.
There you go.
With the reading teacher who helped me when I would get stuck. And so that was how I had to incorporate that kind of focus on women and girls. Another thing I did was when we were studying the civil rights movement, which again wasn't part of the curriculum, but I did it anyway. And I told the Rosa Parks story by reading some literature to the children. And then we had a play.
Many of your students were African American.
Yes, yes. I always
It's
worked with
important
mixed
to
groups.
have their
Absolutely.
diversity and.
Yes, children have to see themselves in the classroom and in the curriculum so that they don't feel left out, because they're literal thinkers, small children are, and if they don't see pictures of kids like them, then they get the impression that no kids like them did that or can do that. That was true with women in our time. We never saw pictures of women in history books or anything, and so the assumption was, and some people felt that for decades, well then women weren't there, they didn't do anything.
Well, we're here at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center to make sure people learn that story about how her story goes to history to make our story. And I think it's so important to have women visible and women in on the names of the streets and so on, and statues. There's a big movement right now to have more women on statues and so on, and more visible. We'll be right back. Thank you so much.
This is Elaine Harmon, and Elaine served in the WASP in World War II.
I'm just impressed with this program, although I can't hear a word anybody says. I'm confused. But it's nice to know that the young generation still appreciates what everybody did their part during World War II.
Well, I'm Susan King, and last night I was told that I would represent our chapter of Rosa the Riveter. We are a chapter. We're not growing because we did not. And one day we'll look around and we would have really shrunk. We've looked all around in my travels with the Rosa the Riveter, the national chapter. We've looked around for the scarcity, and we found out that I am the scarcity because we haven't been able to find any Afro-Americans who would admit to being as old maybe as I am.
Welcome back to the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. We're here with Linda Lindsey, who is a board member with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and she'll tell us more about the Unsung Heroines program that we have here at the center.
The program that we had in September of 2012 was designed to honor and recognize the women who participated in the World War II era, either through the military service or through working on the home front. Mm-hmm. And there were thousands and thousands of women who did their part to fight the war. And so we wanted to make sure that these women who were local were recognized and honored, because so many of them are passing on.
Yes.
These women in their 80s and 90s now. And when I saw how the women's families, when they came, what a new pride and information they got about their moms or their aunts or their grandmothers, It made me sad that so many of these women have passed on, and perhaps their families didn't hear those stories.
Well, many families were encouraged not to talk about their accomplishments or what they did during the war. And I think that's why it's so important for our children to ask their grandparents, what did you do during that time? Or what were your roles? Or ask about how their family was participating. We need to get those stories saved.
Absolutely.
We're going to go to a clip right now to learn more about our unsung heroines.
I'd like to introduce Betty Prince Sims. She goes by Princey, I understand. She served in the Marines.
This has been a busy week for me. Wednesday I went down to, I come from Silver Spring, I live in Leisure World, and they had a big meeting of all World War veterans, World War II veterans. And so it was very interesting. There was a WAF there from World War II who was 102 years old. She'd been in the post office in Europe. She was in a wheelchair, looked very well. And I sat there in my shirt, like this. I don't know why they told me to sit.
Okay, we have Edith Esslinger with us, who is an Army nurse from World War II.
Fortunate for me to be living my 93rd year and meeting people like Lindsey and learning of the accomplishments of Maryland Women's Heritage Society. I was the result of my father's 5th attempt for a boy. He died of a heart attack at 69 in March of 42, and I know he would have been approved of my joining the Army in August 1942. Diane Sumner with us from the Waves. Would you like to just make a few comments about your...
In 1939, I was up in the French Alps climbing, late September, when Hitler went into Poland. And the first mobilization started in France. And because I was fluent in French and I was alone, I was 15, I got myself to Paris with what I had with me. And I managed to get Little Havre and get on a boat on the last. And it was the little President Roosevelt. It was a small American liner. And we zigzagged across the Atlantic for 2 weeks in a blackout.
Their stories are so inspiring. What are some of the women that really stand out in your mind about the impact that they made here?
During the World War II era?
Sure.
There were so many women that volunteered. It was an all-volunteer service for women. And they were just so anxious to do whatever they could. Their husbands, their brothers, in some cases their fathers were all fighting, and they felt like it was their fight too. It was their country too, and they wanted to join.
Linda, tell us about some of the women who were here at the event.
It was so exciting to research women who were local, who had participated in the war, either on the military front or on the home front. Then we began to amass a group of names and contacted many of these women to see who could join us on that day. And one of the women that I knew personally, her story was very interesting. A 94-year-old Edith Esslinger, who was a nurse in the Army during the war. And she and I know each other because we work out at the same gym.
94?
Yes, she comes 2 days a week, and she just has this wonderful personality. And I remember talking to her one time, and she mentioned that she had been an Army nurse. And so
Was she stationed here, or was she abroad, or?
She was stationed in Europe. She had her training in Texas. And she was supposed to go to North Africa, but by the time her unit was ready to deploy, that fight had wound down, and so they sent her to Europe. She was actually stationed in London, and she was one of the first nurse anesthetists. And when she left the service, because she stayed in through the Korean War, she returned to the States and married a man from Baltimore and ended up living in Baltimore, and for the rest of her working career, she was a nurse anesthetist at local hospitals here. But the funny thing about it was that when I found out that she had been in the Army Corps, Nurse Corps, then when I found out that we were going to do this show, I said, oh, we can have a live Army nurse person. So I said something to Edith, and she was very humble, and at first didn't think much about it. But eventually, she did decide to participate, and her speech was just wonderful. She was prepared, and all her children were here, and a couple of her grandchildren were here. And I'll never forget her first line. She said, "I was my father's 5th attempt at a boy." And she told me that, and she said this in her speech that day, that the reason she joined the service was the war had started, her dad had recently passed away, and she knew that he had always wanted a son, and she was the 5th girl. And she said to herself, you know, if I had been that boy, I'm sure I would be volunteering to go into the service, or I would have been drafted. So she volunteered as a trained nurse. She was put into the Army Nurse Corps and spent 14 years in the service.
Well, what a contribution. And also the ability to travel the world and to bring that experience back to Baltimore and contribute her medical skills here in the Baltimore area.
And Edith's experience was really what we discovered, those of us who were working on this program. My co-chair was Jean Cooper. We discovered that all these women that we got to know and whose stories we read they had something in common, and that was this feistiness, this chutzpah. They had it when they were young. That's why they joined whatever, either they became a Rosie the Riveter, or they became a map maker, or they joined one of the services. They flew planes even when the men wouldn't fly the planes, because these were ones that weren't being maintained.
Right.
WASPs, they were called. And all of these women had this one characteristic, and that's that feistiness. And you know what? When we met them in their 80s and 90s,
They still had it?
they still have it.
I love it.
They still have it, absolutely. And one of the women, unfortunately, who was here that day, but she was too ill to actually speak, and so I read her story. Midge Mahoney was a WAC, and she served in New Mexico, where the bomb was being made. And unfortunately, she's passed away since then. But Midge's story that she dictated to her niece, and then her niece sent it to me, it was just amazing. And as a woman who never married and didn't have any children, this was really one of the highlights of her life. And her niece told me that after she passed away, that participating in this program, coming to it, telling her story, and having her story included with the other stories of the wonderful women was the highlight of her last year of her life.
How wonderful. That's so important. And the work that we're doing here at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center about preserving women's stories and learning about these unsung heroines can make a difference in our life, because we can learn from their grit, from their feistiness, how women have always been a part of our society, contributing greatly, and hopefully inspire us to go on to make our contributions and contribute to our world today. Thank you. We'll be back in just a minute.
Recognize and honor women who served in the military and on the home front during World War II. That is the focus. I wanted to introduce the program chair of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, Linda Shevitz.
Linda, Lindsey, and Jean Cooper have just done an incredible job in getting in touch with all of you, and also in putting the program together. So we are just thrilled to have you here.
Welcome back to Her Story and our guest, Linda Lindzey. Linda, I want to find out more about who are the women that really were inspiring you, and what's your story? How are you connected with them?
My story is one of a long journey, actually. I was raised in the 40s and 50s in a typical household with a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was from the Philippines and really wasn't necessarily ingrained in American society. And so he just raised his family and provided for them, and he thought that was his role, and didn't really have much interaction with my sister and I. And so I was really a very typical woman, young woman, graduated from high school in 1961, and nobody mentioned college, even though I was smart and had taken all the right courses. So I didn't go on to college, and I ended up marrying my high school sweetheart, And that didn't last very long, and then I just was a secretary for a while, and then I started reading books and listening to things on talk shows. That was back when the topics were very meaty and serious. And then the women's movement came along, and I started reading about that, and I just became a completely different person. I found out that I had worth, that I didn't have to be attached to a man to accomplish things in life. And so then in the meantime, I did get married again and started having children and stayed home for 9 years raising my sons. And then it was time for me to go to my next stage in life. And that's when I decided to go back to school to become a teacher. I had taught in preschool, but you didn't have to have a degree to do that.
Right.
So I went back to school, and then I took my women's studies courses. And then, as my sister-in-law says, that's when I went through my militant period. And because with my academic underpinning and my personal experience living through having changed from a very traditional young woman to a feminist, it was just a whole different lifestyle for me.
So Linda, you're telling me you went through this metamorphosis.
Yes.
Who are some of the women out in the community that you saw that inspired you to reach out for a different career path?
I didn't really connect with these women until I was on that different career pattern, and I didn't really connect with too many people locally until I began to join women's organizations. I joined Maryland Now. I joined associations that were dedicated to educational equity and non-sexist child raising and non-sexist teaching. And I met a woman named Linda Shevitz. She and I were at the same conference, and I remember amassing all my gender equity materials and going off to this early childhood conference because I used to feel like I was the only one thinking about these things, and I would be feeling like I were out on the end of a plane wing by myself. So I go to this conference, and next to me there's this woman named Linda who's setting up her display, and she actually is sanctioned by the State Department of Education of Maryland and works as their equity officer. And she and I connected immediately, and she gave me resources, and I even had a couple resources that she didn't have, and that was the beginning of a 30-some year relationship with Linda Shevitz. And we ended up both volunteering at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. So we've known each other for a long time. Linda was a mentor in that area, and many of the people that I read about when I was taking my women's history courses, the women's studies courses, we went back to the history of women who were fighting for suffrage and who were fighting for the abolitionist movement. And it was the required reading to go back and learn all about these women. And those women vicariously then were my role models, because it opened my eyes so that my role model was my mom, of course, and my older sister, but my mom had been a stay-at-home mom and a person who didn't know her worth, and so she didn't see herself in this sphere outside of the home.
Well, times were changing, and you were trying to go with the changes that were going on in our community. Well, that's what's so important to understand, and you found this out, is that through women's stories, we find out that we're not alone.
Yes.
We're not alone in this struggle, and that we all have worth. What it is to discover within ourselves what it is we have to offer and go for it. It's that grit. It's that change, that determination. I am somebody and I matter. That's what we do here at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, is we capture these stories and we're able to share them so we can learn from these women valuable lessons that will take us forward in our own lives. Sybil Ludington, she's a tremendous story. Tell us a little bit more about her.
Well, everyone knows about the ride of Paul Revere. And during the Revolutionary War, quite often, when the troops were coming, when the British were coming, small villages and towns were needing to know that information. And of course, we all know that Paul Revere made this wonderful ride to warn everybody that the British were coming, and they have the signal system. Well, a lot of other people did the similar things, and one of them was Sybil Ludington, a 16-year-old daughter of a captain in the American Army, and she found out from her dad that the British were coming, and she knew that the local people in the area and the people in their town needed to be warned so that the militia would be ready, and there wasn't anybody else to do it. So she got on her horse and she rode around the town and all around the farms to warn people that indeed they had discovered that the British were going to be attacking and they needed to be ready. Now, unlike Paul Revere, Sybil was a young girl. She did not demand pay, and she did this as a volunteer, even against her father's will. And so I always thought that story was so inspiring, that a child so young but so dedicated to helping her father and the war effort, that she would risk her life at night to go out alone, which is something women and girls never did in those days, because of her, what drove her was the effort to save her town. And this is an important story for kids, especially girls, to know. And there is a children's book written about Sybil Ludington. And so that's the kind of literature that we encourage teachers to read to their children, so that they will know these stories. And the fact that it's a true story is so uplifting to kids, to find out that there was this young girl that had enough, that was brave enough to do that.
Linda, it's been so special having you here with us on the show.
We've been friends for a long time.
We
and
have
I just
indeed.
love spending time with you, Kate.
Well, you've been an inspiration to me in watching you work with your kindergarteners. Linda had me to her school and I performed a program for her students, and they just lapped it up. And I know it's because you led the way in getting women's stories out, piqued their interest, and so it really was validating when I came in to do my show. And it's just so important that both boys and girls, men and women, learn these women's stories, because they have so much to add to our lives. Thank you so much for joining us here today at HERSTORY at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. We'll be back another week with more programming. That was a wonderful segment with Linda Lindsey. That's the kind of woman that we want to interview here at the Maryland Women's Center. Share the link with your friends and tell them about our programs. Let's spread the word.